Welcome to the Bible in a Year podcast, a resource from Enter the Bible. Journey with us through the books of the Bible, discovering more about Scripture and how it shapes our lives today. I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker, professor of Old Testament at Luther Seminary.
And I'm Jenny Wojciechowski, assistant professor of church history at Luther Seminary.
And today we're joined by Kathryn Howard, associate professor of Old Testament, also at Luther Seminary, and a friend and colleague of ours. Thanks so much for joining us, Kathryn.
Thanks for having me.
So today's episode is on 1st and 2nd Kings, and just a word of explanation where usually we do one book in each episode. Obviously, we're covering a lot of territory here with 1st and 2nd Kings, but actually these are one book in the Jewish counting of the books of the Bible. So they're just called Kings together. They're divided into 1st and 2nd Kings simply for the sake of length, because that would be one really huge book to have 1st and 2nd Kings together. But really, they are treated as one book, really, and the story crosses the divide between 1st and 2nd Kings. So let's dive in to 1st and 2nd Kings.
Kathryn, can you give us a quick summary of this book or books, however you want to consider it?
Yeah, I like to think of it as one book just because it is part of a continuous story and was originally one book. But the title is a good hint to what we're hearing about here. We're hearing about the kings of the monarchic period of ancient Israel. And so the book starts at the very end of King David's reign and tells us about kings of, first of all, will tell us about a little fight for who's going to be king after David. It goes to Solomon, David's son, and then when Rehoboam, Solomon's son, becomes king, the kingdom splits into two kingdoms. And this is an important thing to understand as you're reading Kings and as you're reading a lot of the prophets in the Old Testament, that somewhere around 922 BCE, the kingdom splits into Israel in the north with Samaria as its capital, and Judah in the south with Jerusalem as its capital. And so you have these deeply connected, sort of once joined together kingdoms that their stories are being told alongside one another, and it will switch back and forth sometimes between talking about kings of Israel and kings of Judah. And yet sometimes Israel will be used as the name of the people Israel, which constitutes everyone, northern and southern kingdoms. So that can be a little bit confusing. So it's worth, as you read, just sort of taking stock that you know where you are. Is this about the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom, or is it sort of everybody together? So you get these stories about the kings of Israel and Judah all the way until Babylon besieges Judah. Well, Israel falls first and then is out of the picture for a while, and you have only Judah remaining. Israel falls to Assyria, and then Babylon besieges Jerusalem and takes Judah. And so at the very end of 2nd Kings, you have the fall of the kingdom of Judah, the fall of Jerusalem, the exile of most of the elites of Judah to Babylon, and Babylonian control there. So it's really a story of demise in some ways. It's a downward trajectory from the heights of the kingdom united in David and Solomon to the loss of that kingdom, the loss of the temple, and also sort of the possibility of the loss of the promise. That's something that's always shadowing the books of Kings. If God promised land and descendants to Abraham and grace to David and a descendant on the throne forever for David, what does it mean now that we have lost that land? Does that mean that the promises of God have been lost? And that's something that's not resolved in 2nd Kings, but is very much taken up in the prophets and other places in the Bible. And of course, the answer is no, the promises are not lost, but the understanding of that is being worked out even as these stories are being told.
So it sounds like the book spans hundreds of years. Is that correct?
It does. It does. It would chronicle from the mid-10th century BCE until the early 6th century BCE. That would be the sort of the time span described in 1st and 2nd Kings.
Kathryn, how would you sum up the message of this book in a few sentences?
That's an interesting question because in some ways, the book doesn't have a sort of clear message. That is, It's not easy to sort of read it and get guidance for my life or even for the life of ancient Israel. It's really wrestling with this question. And so I'm going to maybe get ahead of ourselves a little bit, but I think that it's really important to know that First and Second Kings was written either in or after exile. And of course, that's just sort of obvious from the book. I mean, it ends in exile and it's talking about the past, So the author knows how this is going to end. And so even as it's sort of just giving us the stories that have been preserved of these kings of the past, it's also reckoning with a theological problem. Which is, why would God give us all of this and take it away? Or what have we done to deserve this? Because it ends again in exile. In exile, but with a Davidic king still alive in Babylon. So there is a sort of glimmer of hope in that way. But I mean, I think it certainly has the message that people are sinful. And especially leaders can lead the people into sin because the kings are responsible for a lot of the apostasy that's decried in the book. But also that God cares what people do. God cares how we as human beings and in our communities and city-states and nations and peoples, how we live our lives, how we conduct ourselves. I think that sense of God's care for and often disappointment in humanity comes through in First and Second.
Yeah.
But, and also I think more implicitly, but certainly there, is the idea that God still accompanies the people, even when they are disappointing God over and over again. God continues to accompany these people. And then, so when you get to Ezekiel, for instance, which is also set around the time of exile, roughly, and Ezekiel is going to wrestle with that theological question. Where is God? If God's supposed to be in the temple and we don't have a temple anymore, where is God? And Ezekiel will come to the conclusion that God has traveled into exile with us, and will bring us back. So First and Second Kings, on the one hand, has a lot of like classic stories and ideas in it that stand on their own. But I think it's important to put First and Second Kings as sort of part of a bigger narrative of this theological history of ancient Israel.
Thanks. My question is on context. Now, you already said that the book was written while in exile. So was it written in Babylon? And then also, who was the original audience?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we don't know exactly the answers to those questions. But the sort of reigning theory is that some scribes who were really shaped by the theology that we see in the book of Deuteronomy. So the book of Deuteronomy emphasizes God's covenant fidelity to Israel, God's calling of Israel into the land, and also God's sort of, in that part of that covenant is that if you, the people, keep your end of the covenant, then there will be blessings. And if you break the covenant, there will be curses. So that seems to be the kind of theology that the writer or writers probably of the books of Kings bring to their telling of these stories. And so those scribes are either in exile, or my inclination is that it's after the exile, but still the shadow of exile, the influence of exile is very much there for those scribes. So again, like, we don't know exactly. And we do think that this book probably has several kind of layers in it, that it was edited over time. That some of the material that talks about the northern kingdom and the northern traditions was probably separate from the material about Judah for a while, and then eventually it was integrated together. So we have a sort of vague sense, but not all of the details about who wrote it and when.
Yeah, and there's a lot of discussion about that, as there is about every. I mean, this is how Bible scholars make a living, right, Cameron? There's,
Right.
there's disagreement, there's argument, and that there's, as you say, layers and some early material that's passed down, like about Elijah and Elisha, and those. So, maybe even some material from before the exile, or probably some material before the exile that gets incorporated into the final books as we have them. Yeah. All right, we've come to the time for Bible Bingo. So for those of you new to our Bible in a Year, we ask our contributors to name 5 concepts, words, people, places that would be on your bingo card as you read this book of the Bible. So Cameron, you have listed First Kings. I wonder why. First and Second Kings.
I mean, it seems so obvious, and it is, but it is like the focus of the books of Kings.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So it's there a lot. And I think also by saying Kings, that helps us to recognize that this is not a book or books about everyday Israelites. So it's not giving us much of a window into what life was like for an ordinary person.
Mm-hmm.
So we shouldn't extrapolate from, like, if we're trying to think about what can we know about the culture and the time, we shouldn't extrapolate to all Israelites, because this is about the rich and famous.
Yeah,
it's about the kings. It's about the people with power and how they're making their decisions.
Yeah. Your second term on your bingo card is prophets.
Yeah. So prophets are often, and certainly this is true in the Hebrew Bible, associated with kings. A prophet is a kind of counselor to the king who is bringing a word from the Lord and interpreting that and bringing it to the king. And so when the monarchy flourishes in ancient Israel, prophecy also flourishes. And we see that beginning here. Well, first of all, in 1st and 2nd Samuel, you see that with Saul, this idea that is Saul among the prophets, that he himself fell among bands of prophets, that, of course, David has Nathan and others. So prophecy is present in 1st and 2nd Samuel. But when we get into 1st and 2nd Kings, we have Elijah and Elisha coming onto the scene, who are a new and different kind of prophet, who kind of embody the power of God and are able to do miracles. And in addition to sort of bringing a word from the Lord and having this sort of showdown often with kings, often opposing them and their actions, or sort of warning them not to worship other gods,
right,
but to worship only the God of Israel. And that in that miracle working and that relationship with God that's brought to the people, we see a lot of, well, when we read the Gospels, the stories about Jesus and Jesus's miracle working are very much on the pattern of Elijah and Elisha. So when you read the prophets, and especially read about Elijah and Elisha in 1st and 2nd Kings, it's worth paying attention to, where do we see things that we will see again, that we will see Jesus described as doing by the gospel writers, and sort of in this line of prophets.
Could you give us just a couple examples, like a couple of miracles we see repeated? It's like raising the dead, or...
Yeah, well, certainly raising the dead. Elisha will do that. Also, the providing of food. So, for example, the widow of Zarephath, and the jars of oil that are almost empty will then last, right? That food for the starving. Attention to the widow. Attention to people who are marginalized in society is also something that Elijah and Elisha are into. Yeah, there. And so that those same kinds of miracles then are reflected in the life of Jesus.
So kings and prophets, your next two are also a pair. So Israel and Judah. Why are those on your bingo card?
Yeah, this is my hope to emphasize again that you have to pay attention to where your kings are as you're reading. Are they in Israel, the northern kingdom? Are they in Judah, the southern kingdom? And what's also important to remember is that 1st and 2nd Kings is written from the perspective of Judah, the southern kingdom. That is, they have the last word. And the northern kings, come off looking even worse than the Southern kings. The Southern kings are pretty bad, but then the Northern kings are even worse. And you do sometimes get a sense that maybe if the Northerners, if Israel had been telling its own story and Judah hadn't had editorial control, that maybe things would have gone a little bit differently. But so that matters. That's part of the authorship question, that Judah's scribes probably had the final say.
Well, they're the only ones surviving at the end, right? Like Israel doesn't exist anymore. With perhaps some caveats there. That's where we get the Samaritans. But yes. All right. So kings, prophets, Israel, Judah. Your last one kind of surprised me a bit. Jezebel. Why is Jezebel on your bingo card?
Jezebel is on my bingo card because I think that Jezebel is the paradigm for all of the anxieties that the books of Kings have about foreign women, that is, non-Israelite women. So it's something we see in Deuteronomy, a warning against kings not to marry non-Israelites, a warning against the people, the men of Israel, not to marry non-Israelite women. And it's a worry that Kings has. And as these scribes are doing this backwards reflection, thinking back what happened, they're going to put a lot of blame on kings who marry foreign women and the reason they have this anxiety is because foreigners, non-Israelites, worship other gods. Because remember, that was in a different podcast episode, but in the Exodus episode, I talked about how every region of the, ancient Western Asia has its own god or gods or goddesses that are associated with a particular place. And so you have the God of Israel, of course, associated with Israel. But if you marry someone from Phoenicia, for example, like Jezebel, then she will have other gods and goddesses that she grew up worshiping. And so the anxiety of the people writing Kings is that these foreign women will bring their foreign gods into the marriage and sway the heads and hearts of the kings toward other gods. And so Jezebel is kind of the prime example of this. Her husband is Ahab, and she, in fact, not only does she sort of influence Ahab in this way, but she also then sort of acts on Ahab's behalf in the story of the killing of Naboth to take his vineyard. Jezebel basically acts on Ahab's behalf and sets up this righteous guy, Naboth, and has him stoned to death on false charges so that Ahab can have his vineyard. And so all of this then, not only is it about the anxiety about foreign women, but then also goes back to this fundamental question that 1st and 2nd Kings is reflecting on that comes from 1 Samuel 8. When the people ask for a king and Samuel says, this is what a king will do. A king will take and take and take from you. You don't want a king, but they say, no, give us a king to be like other nations. So not only is there a sort of theological reckoning about how did we get into exile, there's also this reckoning about should we even ever have had a king? And that set up way back in 1 Samuel 8, this question, when the people ask for a king and Samuel says kings will take. And so Jezebel, by setting up Naboth and taking his vineyard for Ahab, is also sort of the poster person for kings are bad. Now, there's lots of stuff in Samuel and Kings that says kings are good. I mean, David, just Solomon's wisdom and wealth. There are lots of other places that say kings are good, but then there are also all these places that say actually kings are bad. And so when I said earlier that it's hard to sum up the message of 1st and 2nd Kings, I also think that it's trying to give us a message about kings, but it comes out sort of both ways. Kings are good and we should embrace them, and kings are bad and they led us into these terrible things. So Jezebel's story would be another piece of that puzzle as well.
That's really helpful. We're done with Bible Bingo. Thank you for playing.
Yes, thanks. It was really interesting, Kathryn. All right. What is really weird or interesting about the books of 1st and 2nd Kings?
Oh my gosh, so much is weird. which also
All right,
which
top
also
3, baby.
makes it interesting. I mean, the stories about Elijah and Elisha are very interesting. I mean, there's the one where the kids make fun of Elisha and they get mauled by bears.
And they make
Even
fun of him because he's bald, right? Am I remembering
right.
that right?
They call
Yeah.
him names about his
Yeah,
baldness.
yeah.
That's sensitive, huh?
Yeah, so that's weird. There's there's a lot of palace intrigue. So if you like Game of Thrones, right? I mean, this is like OG Game of Thrones. There's so much back and forth, jockeying for position, wars, all that sort of thing. There's the story that has two women come to Solomon. It's a test of his wisdom. There are 2 prostitutes, and there's 2 babies born, and one of them dies. Whose baby died? And Solomon says, "Split the living baby." Right? I mean that's interesting.
Right.
That's in First
Yeah.
Kings 3. Yeah, it's weird. It's clever. It's this sort of wisdom riddle. Like, how do you solve a difficult problem? And so that's, on the one hand, entertaining to read, also kind of troubling as well.
The baby lives, just a spoiler alert. Baby lives.
Right. They don't. I'm sorry. Yes,
Right.
they don't.
No, that's all right.
split
That's
the
all.
baby. No,
Yeah.
I'm doing this poor job on that. As one time I heard this story told in a children's sermon, and it was a disaster.
Oh, no.
Oh, no. Oh.
Yeah, probably not the subject of a children's sermon.
No. And that's another thing to say about First and Second Kings. Like, it's all PG-13 except for the parts that are rated R.
Yeah.
Which brings me to my favorite weird story in Kings, which is in Second Kings, when Rehoboam, Solomon's son, has ascended to be the king, and he's trying to decide if he should continue this practice of forced labor that his father had instituted. And there's a place in which his advisors, I'm sorry, I said Second Kings, it's First Kings, come to him and say, "Thus you should say to the people who don't want you to do this forced labor anymore, my little finger is thicker than my father's loins." And that means exactly what you think that
Yeah.
means.
Yeah.
That's in First Kings 12. So there's, again, it's not all children's sermon material by any means, and
Nope.
it's much more like Game of Thrones. But it's also, in all of this, there is also the story of God's faithfulness. How is Israel, now that it is this big monarchy, right, going to live in relationship with God? And so it's not just a history. It's a theological reflection. It's not an objective history, but it's a theological telling of the past.
I think that's a great segue into the question, why are First and Second Kings important for Christian life and theology? And I think I hear you saying, right, it's about God's faithfulness in the midst of some pretty sordid kind of actions by the kings.
Yeah. And also circling back to something I said earlier, that God cares what we do. God is not disinterested in the world. Now, there's a lot of work to do to think theologically about how God is active in the world today. But I think it's easy to say, based on the Hebrew Bible, that God is very much concerned with the ways of the world, that the world act justly and righteously. So I think that's reinforced by First and Second Kings.
And actually, that might lead into my last question. What is one key theme that you would like people to look for in this book or these books?
I think I would like them to look for the theme of, I guess I'll call it accountability. The stories can be very fun to read in all of the things that make for good novels and things like that. Lots of action, lots of drama, some disturbing parts for sure. But there is this sense of wanting to understand God's involvement in the world and human accountability to God. And I want to emphasize that we don't have to come out with the exact same theology as the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, or the same understanding, because there are other parts of Scripture that would offer alternative ways for understanding how God is involved in the world. But thinking about that, I think it's not only God's faithfulness, but God's, judgment, I guess is the right word. Not in a way we should be scared of it, but in a way that says it matters how we move through this world in as much as we can control it. But again, also, these are stories of people with power as well. Another thing to remember, these are stories of people who have a particular kind of power in the world as well.
So God cares that Ahab and Jezebel steal Naboth's vineyard and kill him in the process, to go back to that earlier story, right? That God does not ignore injustice. Perhaps.
Right. So that then when 1st and 2nd Kings are read alongside the books of the prophets like Amos, Micah, Hosea, Isaiah, which are contemporaneous with parts of 1st and 2nd Kings, the judgment that's named there as well against people in power, the kings and the wealthy in ancient Israelite society, I think that those sort of dovetail with one another. The sense of accountability in 1st and 2nd Kings and the way it's called out in more dramatic fashion in the prophets.
All right, last question, Kathryn. How would you describe 1st and 2nd Kings in 7 words or less?
Most kings are terrible, but God redeems. So a lot of stories about how, you'll notice if you read through, you'll see the refrain, so-and-so, King so-and-so, did what was evil in the sight of the Lord like his father before him.
Right.
Especially as you get toward the end of 2nd Kings, that refrain becomes much more frequent. And it does lead to disaster. But then there's still this hope at the very end when a Davidic king, a descendant of David, is alive in Babylon. And it means the story keeps going. It means there's opportunity for God to redeem this situation, to work right out of the chaos of human sin, something more.
That's lovely. Thank you. Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you so much for being with us, Kathryn, and talking about 1st and 2nd Kings. I really appreciate it. And thank you to you, our listeners. This has been the Bible in a Year podcast from Enter the Bible. Check out more great resources on the Bible at enterthebible.org. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast app or watching on YouTube, we appreciate you being with us. You can get more great resources like this, conversations, reflections, commentaries, courses, anything that you could need as you dive in and enter the Bible with curiosity and faith. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review or like and subscribe. And of course, the very best compliment you could pay us is to share this podcast with a friend. Until next time.